This is a part 2 of the Humourology Podcast, and my guest is once again the wonderful comedian, communicator, curmudgeon, Simon Evans. We're going to pick up where we left off. Earlier on in the show, I said you were an only child, brought up in St Albans, but I met you originally through your brother David.
That's right. Yeah.
So that'll confuse the audience.
Yeah.
Could you just tell us a little bit about this extraordinary story? Because I'm interested in and how you coped with all the information you got from this. But if you just give us a thumbnail of it.
Yeah, sure. I took a DNA test in 2018. To this day, I struggle to explain exactly why, but just idle curiosity, really, about various things. But no suspicion that I would find anything really extraordinary. But I did. I discovered that I was donor conceived, artificial insemination. My father, who is still alive, it turns out, was unable to father children, and after 7 or 8 years of trying, my parents decided to go to a clinic where my mother was given a sperm donation, and she was assured at the time, they were assured it would be like a close ethnic match. They were sort of led to believe probably a medical student, something like that, a man of good quality, good genetics, but utterly anonymous. It turns out it was actually a sperm donation from the husband of the woman who ran the clinic. Her name was Mary Barton. His name was Bertolt Wiesner. And Wiesner had been supplying the vast majority of the sperm necessary for their clients over the course of about 23 years in that clinic. He's thought to have fathered somewhere between 600 and 1,000 children, but that we really have no idea. But that's extrapolating from data that we do have. And so I got these results back and was immediately introduced to all these people. I was half brothers and sisters, and there's about 60 of us who know each other now. And there's a WhatsApp group, an email group. There are regular meetups and so on. Most of them are a bit older than me. I was born towards the end of the lifespan of that clinic, as indeed was your friend David. We're about the same age, born in 65. There are some of them go back all the way to the mid-40s. So they feel a bit more like aunts and uncles in a sense, some of them to me. And of course, I'm in denial about how old I am myself. But yes, I suddenly have this huge sort of second family, really, which has been almost unadulterated joy. They're a lovely bunch of people. It was initially a little bit overwhelming, obviously, and confusing, but I went home and told my parents that I'd learned the truth, and they were relieved to find that I wasn't, didn't feel like I'd been deceived or somehow kept out of the picture. I understood they were told very sternly by the clinic not to mention anything. And I think most people who had conceived through that clinic decided it was best if nobody knew, because once the word gets out at all, it's bound to come back. So even my brother, my mother's an only child as well, as it happens. And my father has only one half sister, and she didn't know until about 3 weeks after I told them. So, it had been an absolutely tightly sealed little secret, which they've been carrying with them, bless them, for the whole sort of half century.
Well, it's an extraordinary story, and some people would crumble under the weight of that story and go, my whole weight's a lie. How did humour actually help you to cope with it, if you like, or see it from a different perspective?
Well, I certainly found it was a fabulous thing to talk about on stage. I was anxious about it at first. I did a show about it in 2019. So about 6 months after I'd learned the truth, I was, this show was written and ready to go. But what it wasn't entirely about that. It was kind of a re-examination of my sense of humor and my comedy over 25 years or so, seen through the light of discovering that I was half Jewish and that my father wasn't my father and so on. And some of that is quite superficial, I had a terrible experience watching Chelsea play. Well, it turns out I'm a Spurs fan, aren't I? So just silly jokes like that. But other things were what I found for a long time as a stand-up, I had been starting to feel that it was a bit relentless, just going from one joke to the next. It was a bit flat, a bit monotone in a sense. It was a good tone. It would lift people up. Over a 20-minute set, of course, it's ideal. But if you're doing an hour and a half on stage in front of people, I wanted a little bit, something of the bittersweet, a little bit more light and shade, And as I mentioned in that same article that you referenced. And there's always there's a danger that you try and contrive something in order to get that, I'm going to talk about, caring for my mother as she slid into dementia or something. Well, there are things, of course, in everyone's life, but you don't just want to retreat to the obvious tropes. So this really gave me an opportunity to talk about something that was a lot deeper, to talk about, I'd done so much material over the years, which was essentially complaining that my life was needlessly complicated. And when I look back to my father's life as a dad, his life had been very simple. It turns out his life wasn't nearly as simple as I thought it had been. He'd had to take a huge decision to even have me, And so it was an opportunity to express a bit of gratitude, to express a little bit of humility, really, having confronted a truth that I hadn't previously suspected. I made a fairly conscious decision not to allow myself to think I've been deceived, I've been let down, I've been, people who should have had my best interests at heart have instead kept important details from me, because they were told that was for the best, and that's as much as you could say about it. And the truth is, it probably was a good idea. I think before DNA tests came out, before we could say, oh my God, there's loads of us, that wouldn't have been a thing that they would have anticipated. No. It would have just been some random piece of a jigsaw puzzle and the rest of it would have been lost. So that was all good. But yeah, the ability to find humor in it, I think is lovely, partly because everyone is slightly shocked when I tell them the story on stage. They sense the sort of emotional gravity of it. And so, of course, they're hugely relieved when you crack a joke about it. You break that tension. That's what everyone knows a lot of comedy is about, creating a certain amount of tension in the room and then relieving it, and to be able to make that kind of, I am dealing with this and this was quite, whoa, suddenly like the earth, opens up, the floor disappears. And everyone goes, yeah, my God, that must be weird. And then you throw them a lifeline and go, and here's a joke about it. It gets a huge reaction, as much as I say, of gratitude on their part that you're not going to force them to live with this tension, for long periods of time.
Well, and of course, the truth goes down a lot easier when a joke is attached, doesn't it? So it's a very powerful medium to see that. But I also think therapeutically, it's actually very valuable, because what happens in humor is you have to take a different perspective on something, don't you? You have to look at it from a different angle. And so rather than being right in it, I'm wondering if the comedian's brain is always going and looking at it from another angle, and therefore all trauma becomes slightly easier to cope with. Do you think that's true?
It's a very interesting proposition. I do think that talking about your trauma is almost always good, but because you're trying to make it funny and people are paying to come and see a comedy show and not to hear somebody sort of complain for an hour and a half, you are forced to frame it that way. Even if you might be feeling 50-50, you might be feeling, well, this is funny and full of ironies and kind of hilarious, and also this is upsetting, and oh my God, I'll never meet my father. I've never, my father was dead when I was 5 years of age, and I've never heard of him until I'm in my 50s. That could be, you could find some cause for upset in that. But because you have to make it funny in order to justify putting it on stage and people coming to watch you and listen to you, that becomes a self-reinforcing notion to yourself that this is the appropriate way to think about it, and that there is almost nothing that I have encountered in my life anyway that is off limits, that you shouldn't joke about, as long as you acknowledge that it has a number of facets, and however terrible it is, however painful it was, however tragic it is, however evil the perpetrator was, blah, 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 still, we cannot ignore the fact that, there are hugely funny aspects to the Nazis, there just are. And Freddie Starr,
the producers.
Yeah, exactly. It's brilliant. But we've become very precious about that again at the moment. I don't know. We may be in a sort of strange, like an uncanny valley almost, the amount of distance between us and the Second World War at the moment, that like we seem to be a lot less capable of laughing about it than people were in the 50s, 60s and 70s. I think it's strange, but we've become a lot more kind of uber sensitive about anyone who might have actually sort of had their family killed or whatever. of course, that is, that's part of it. But humor can be a great mechanism for just getting on with life, and not making yourself into a victim. That's one of the worst things, I think, about the modern era, is that victimhood has become a high status position. And that's something that comedy does dissolve quite quickly. It takes the piss, and that's a really, that's a good robust response to that notion.
I completely agree, and it's interesting when you read, I don't know if you've read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and he talks about, this is a concentration camp, and he talks about how important humor was to do that. My father was 17 years old, stationed outside Dresden, and spent 3 months going in and out of Dresden because he was Hungarian, and they went eventually and joined the Allies, but originally they were conscripted into the Hungarian army. And so, but then he had to watch for 36 hours as Dresden was leveled. And he said to me, he knew these people. They were old people, children, and women in there. And that's war. But he said most of the time they survived by going up to Germans and making them laugh, because then they would feed them. And humor was that bridge that you couldn't. And he said, I know there were horrible things, but there were nice Germans there as well. And that's kind of really a difficult thing to say. Everything's black and white now.
There are certain kinds of evil and certain kinds of atrocities that are regarded as being unexampled. There was a great story, I wish I could remember who it was, but I think it might have been Evelyn Waugh, who told a story about men in a concentration camp in Burma, and they're living in terrible crowded conditions. There's half a dozen of them in a small cabin. They're not working at that particular time, but there's liquid mud under the floor. There's terrible food. Half of them have got dysentery and all the rest of it. Regardless, nevertheless, one of them has managed to fall asleep, and they look on him with a certain amount of envy for he's escaped the horror of it briefly, and he's fallen into a deep slumber. And then he starts twitching and moaning, and then he starts calling out, and he's obviously in some distress, into having a nightmare of some sort. And they think, oh God, we're going to have to wake him up, aren't we? Because he's more unhappy. But it's a terrible kind of dichotomy. Do you reintroduce him to the reality, which is horrible, or let him suffer in the nightmare, which is horrible? So they woke him up anyway, and he came to his senses, and he said, "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry, chaps. I dreamt I was back in Tunbridge, his grammar school. He had such a miserable time at Tunbridge, grammar school or public school, beaten by the masters, and cold showers, and sleeping. It was actually worse than where they were now." And I mean, there's a lot. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that was an intentional priming, of course, in the school system for boys of a certain class were being prepared to go out into the empire and colonial management and so on, and endure horrors and hardship, and it was toughening them up as much as it was teaching them dates and geography and so on. But we've sort of started to believe that there are certain things that are sacrosanct and can't be joked about. But as I say, it wasn't the case at the time. Again, First World War, the Somme and so on, always seen now as absolutely horrific beyond redemption. But a lot of the men who came back said actually there was a lot of camaraderie in the trench. If you survived, it was, and people in the Blitz in London, there's some very interesting studies of the sort of mindset that was adopted there, not sort of consciously or as a top-down attempt to allow people to survive it psychologically, but just as an emergent phenomenon that people began to feel lucky. If they survived a bombing, they didn't just kind of go, well, that was close. They actually went, oh, hey, you didn't get me. Aha, sod you, Jerry, and you went through a few weeks of that, and you start to feel like king of the world, like you're walking around the rubble and you're thinking, I mean, Winston Churchill said nothing greater than no greater thrill than to be shot at without consequence.
Well, my father used to go through his life. He's unfortunately been dead for 6.5 years, but he used to say, I'm lucky. And if you listen to the litany of things that happened to my father, 17 years old in Dresden, 18 years old going in with the Allies to Berlin in the front line, then all being put in a camp while they worked out who was friend or foe, then traveling to get back to Hungary, then starting again, then the uprising in Hungary in 56 and having to escape, walking 4 days through the snow, putting in a refugee camp, coming to a new country, with leaving his family behind. They ended up having to stay there because of the Russians, and and he would go, I'm lucky. And I have this thing now whereby I'm constantly going, I'm the luckiest person in the world.
Great, isn't it? It's a great feeling to feel lucky and to feel gratitude. I think those are the two things. In a way, I would probably place gratitude a little bit higher, because it's a thing you definitely have control over. I suppose luckiness, it's a sort of way of framing events, but you could argue it one way or the other, and it can potentially, you can end up seeming. There are certain kind of characters in fiction and so on, aren't there? I suppose Candide and so on, who just like relentlessly optimistic despite everything that happens to them. You can become slightly farcical, but to have gratitude for the simple fact that you survive these things, and the general nature of human beings, I think, or at least people that I know, and again, my father the same. I mean, I think men of our father's generation, the reality is they endured things that are far worse than almost anyone encounters now. My father lost his mother to tuberculosis before he was a year old, and that was not unusual before penicillin. There was quite a lot of that kind of stuff, and you lose brothers and sisters, and people used to have more children than they wanted because they knew they'd lose some, So, I mean, we just live in a completely different universe. If those people could find things to laugh about, which they clearly could, the George Formby and Gracie Fields or whatever it was, or the comics, or just the sort of, I've always said that the Forces humor, Trench's humor is some of the funniest. It's not necessarily incredibly sophisticated or witty, but the trenchant kind of the attitude that radiates from some of the banter of men under fire, or nowadays often in operating theatres and so on. It's just hilarious.
We had John Sweeney on, who spent most of the last year in Ukraine, and he has been in 60 war zones and uprisings and things, and he talks about how important that kind of dark humor is to survival. Yeah. And I think it is. Surgeons, I used to train surgeons at Guy's, King's and St Thomas's, and they would have the darkest humor, but sometimes you need that to survive.
I totally agree. And also I would add, you don't even need to justify it like that. If you can laugh, why not laugh? You don't need to say, well, it's a survival mechanism. It may be a survival mechanism. It may also simply be I am happier. This cheers me up, just the way that humor always does. There's nothing distasteful. If you're laughing at someone who is in misery and distress, and they're there present in the room, that's obviously another thing. And then I suppose you might struggle to say, well, it's the only way I get through this. Well, I'm sorry, that there might be, you don't want the police to come to your house to investigate a burglary and have them just openly laughing at the nonsense that the burglars have taken, or the fact that they shat on your rug or something. I mean, that's unkind. But once they've gone in the car, if the police want to turn to each other and go, did you see the state of that vase in the kitchen? What the hell are they? Do you know what I mean? That's fine with me. That if that's, as again, it's not even as a survival mechanism, just if it makes them laugh. I have no quarrel with that at all. I just think people should laugh for its own sake,
I agree. Do you think that anybody can be a good communicator or even a great communicator without understanding humor?
Well, I don't know about understanding. There can be. I wouldn't want to overstress it. There are great communications. There's great prose. There are great speeches that I've come across. I wouldn't say linked. I mean, there's a great old Far Side cartoon where you're looking over Lincoln's shoulder at Gettysburg, at the podium, and he's got his speech, and it goes, and the duck said, "No, that's mine," or something, and he paused for laughter, and then it was 3 score years and 10 ago, and then it moves into the famous address. I mean, the Gettysburg Address is often held up as, you know, the acme of human rhetoric, and there's no jokes in there at all. There's no sense that anyone has any sense of humor. It's a somber occasion, and it's not even particularly like a rallying cry. You know, it's not. I mean, Henry V's speech in the Battle of Agincourt, 2 speeches. You know, those reduce me to shivering tears almost every single time. You know, I sometimes sit and watch Branagh, Olivier, and others on YouTube in succession, just like absolutely bathing in it. You know, the incredible, the poetry, you know, just the understanding of human motivation and again the rhythm, and it's not clever language at all. It's quite earthy, you know, but I just find it absolutely spine tingling. There's no jokes in there at all. So I wouldn't say you need to have jokes, but clearly no. Shakespeare can also write jokes. And I think you have to sort of suppress a sense of humor sometimes, but I suspect anyone who does understand human beings will naturally have a sense of humor. I don't necessarily think it needs to be part of your communication. And there are times when but I mean, I think even now the most celebrated TED talk is the one. I can't remember his name, but it's an educator.
Ken Robinson.
Yeah, talked about the dangers of school sort of crushing creativity in students. Fabulous TED talk. It is amazing. And he uses humor brilliantly, but not in the points that he's making. It oscillates back and forth. So he breaks the tension. He gives you some important information. He makes a strong assertion, and it's thought-provoking. And then while that's sinking in, he kind of, you know, tells a funny story about what it was like flying to America with his son on the flight, and his son would take the headphones off or whatever, that kind of stuff, you know, little kind of observational humor. I don't know whether you'd necessarily say he was using the humor to communicate. It was more like they were a series of palate cleansers between short, pungent, pithy pieces, but they just allowed the rhythm to break in between each piece.
Well, I'd also say that that it is so important to that, and why is it so popular, is because he is creating ultimate connection and rapport with the audience through the humor. Because you could just fire off those facts and it would land completely differently.
That's absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, I think there's at least 2 points. And the one I made is essentially people need a bit of time to absorb the last point before they get the next point, and humor gives that little space. But also the point you've made, which is that it establishes rapport. It means there's understanding. And yes, there's nothing that is more effective at kind of going, I'm just like you. You can trust me. I do understand human beings, as somebody doing that kind of humor. Other kinds of humor, of course, are higher risk, and you might turn people off. So that's, you know, his is very well judged from that point of view. It's quite low status. It's quite self-deprecating. He's presenting himself as a hapless dad. You know, here I am, a man with an expensive mic holding court in a big debating platform. But trust me, there are times when I'm on the school run when I'm just like you. You know, that really works as well.
You're a master at hosting corporate events and awards. What advice would you give to people who have to get up and speak for work events?
Well, they are tricky. I mean, every comedian dreads them a little bit, probably more than they should do. I think part of the reason being, of course, that nobody in the room is paid to see you. There's no expectation. There's no commitment from their point of view. So psychologically, that's a big difference. I, generally speaking, find them more on my wavelength now than comedy club audiences. Comedy club audiences are in the mood for comedy, but they're not necessarily in the mood for a 57-year-old man. They're often sort of in their 20s and 30s, the people who go to comedy clubs, whereas the corporate events are more often my age group, to be honest, and probably a little bit more aligned with me politically and that sort of thing. So I don't find them that frightening. But again, I mean, I wouldn't say there's any major difference. Confidence is absolutely key. And people don't expect any kind of apology. They don't particularly like that kind of, oh, I haven't really rehearsed this sort of thing, but let's see how we go. Or where's the prompter, you know, where's my laser pointer? They like it if you're totally in command. They really do. I do think, you know, working every event I do now, the confidence that the sound desk have as well, those sort of things, and the lights, and get there early and rehearse that properly and make sure that the lighting is good. The sound desk have understood the challenges that you're going to confront, because some rooms are noisy once everyone's in there, you know. And if you have, if they give you a lapel mic or one of those ones that clips onto your ear or whatever, or just like hovers on your cheek, that frees up your hands. Use your hands, because there's nothing worse than somebody with a clip mic just standing there with two like limp, sleeves hanging down either side of their jacket. People like a little bit of that, not too much. If you want somebody who's a master at it, Ron DeSantis, you may not like his politics, but he's fantastic with the hands. It's a little bit Donald Trumpish at times, but do you know him? He's the governor of Florida. He's probably the Republican
next
candidate.
Coming man, isn't he?
Yeah. And as I say, I'm well aware that a lot of people watching this won't like his politics one bit, but you can still learn from his command of a podium is extraordinary. You can watch a few people like that, but I mean, Christopher Hitchens was always like an incredible master, and he was very loose and would break every rule I've just said. He was sort of shamble-on, and Boris Johnson, of course, tie squiffy and one collar out, and he could command £500,000 for a speaking engagement. People loved it. I found it tiresome, that endless kind of performative shamblism, but there are always people who break the rules and get away with it. But if you just want to kind of hit 80%, if you just want to be like safe and know that what you're doing is likely to connect, I would say clean gestures, clean silhouette, clean language. Don't risk like using a little bit of slang to try and break. It's okay for a comedian because we're given license, but if you're a professional and if you are going to use any humor, make it entirely at your own expense or at the expense of somebody the audience has genuine consensus on. There is nothing worse than a performer who assumes a consensus that doesn't exist, So, I mean, obviously the extreme example of that would be to tell a racist joke in front of an audience who don't like racist jokes. It's gone. Do you know what I mean? You're never getting it back from there. But if you tell a joke at your expense or something about company culture that everyone understands, I mean, there are always those kind of feeble jokes that I personally find annoying where the MD takes the piss out of the chief executive for his obsession with Man United, and you just think, oh God, it's such a normie thing to be obsessed with Man United. It's just not interesting, but they love it because they all know about it, and it just connects them. Anything that comedians always do this, anything that lets the audience know what you look like to them, but without being kind of horrifically, squirmingly embarrassed about it, So, I mean, again, I keep referencing him today, but Stuart Lee did a routine taking the piss out of this, where he would just go, I know what you're thinking. So-and-so has let himself go. And he would have a whole list of people who'd let themselves go, and he would kind of go, they all are. He does look a bit like all those people, It might be Tucker off Grange Hill, I think was the first one. But, he does look a little bit like Mark Kermode, the film critic. He does look a little bit like the bloke who used to present The Word. I can't remember his name. And,
Mark Lamar.
It wasn't Lamar, but he does look a bit like Lamar as well. It wasn't Mark,
the Manchester guy,
Manchester one. That's right. Yeah, but he does look a bit like Lamar as well from Buzzcocks. Yeah. Anyway, the point is, if you just say, I do a joke still to this day. Funny enough, I've got a pair of glasses I can do it with. Where I come on, I need my glasses to read the script. I will just say, though, I can't help noticing whenever I wear these glasses, it appears I'm also wearing a false nose. And there is something about glasses and my nose that does make that, well, I mean, I'm not saying nick that joke, but, anything that you can do like that where people go, oh, he knows what he looks like. That's quite good. That helps because it just closes a loop somehow.
Do you remember Cardew Robinson, who was a 100-year-old, and he was a very wizened old man, and he used to do after dinners. And I was lucky enough to meet him and sit down, and we had lunch once, and he said, and he was doing exactly what you do, because by that time he was probably about 85 years old. Wow. And they book him, and he said, I would deliberately shamble on and look very sort of, weakened, and he said, for the first minute, I would 30 seconds, I would look around and go, I'm sorry. And you could feel the audience feeling sorry for him and then feeling awkward and everything. And he goes, I just have to find my glasses. And he would mess with paper and he would get his gun. He goes, unfortunately, and he put the glasses on and goes, unfortunately, my eyes aren't what they used to be. They used to be my bollocks. And he said coming from this old man.
Wow.
It used to just get a woof, and it was a woof of relief.
That's an amazing joke. It's a very good technique is to initially give people the impression that you're not going to be up to the job, and then to prove that you are up to the job. But it's high risk, of course, and you mustn't carry it on for too long. But there are people, that's a great example of it. And of course, to be 85, I mean, to deliberately shamble on, I mean, to be able to shamble on at all at 85 is pretty good. So, fair play to him. Barry Humphries, who we went to see recently, I think was 90, who we saw earlier this year at last year at the Queen's Theatre at the Gilgood in Shaftesbury Avenue. He was just doing a sort of an amble through his life and works, almost like a memoir kind of show. He had, I think there were a lot of people who were worried about whether he got a bit lost a couple of times. He had an auto cue that was presented as if it was a speaker, but it clearly had a teleprompter that was rolling across on it, and he would glance down at it occasionally to pick up his time. But then every so often there'd be a flash of the wit, and as a result, you just felt it, that it was like a little bit of that old steel came out, and it was delicious. It was absolutely, but of course everyone had bought into that. That's a different thing. They're going to see somebody who's given them half a century of pleasure, and they entirely indulge him in being a little bit confused at times and needing to sit down between routines. But I love the Cardew Robinson thing. And I do remember he was on TW3, wasn't he, I think, and things like that, sort of early days of satire. Yeah. I mean, again, if you're venerable in that respect, it gives you something to work with. But there is also that thing of just kind of straightening up and going, anyway, sorry about that. And everyone's, it's a slightly different thing, but what it's reminded me of. Do you remember the film Seven, the Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, with Kevin Spacey as a serial killer? And the first sort of 10 or 15 minutes of that movie, apart from all the grimness generally of murder scenes and so on, is shot in relentless rain. And there's quite a lot of driving scenes, and the rain is thundering on the roof of the car. And it's quite hard to hear what they're saying. And Brad Pitt is kind of going, I don't want to go and do this. Freeman's like, yeah, we got to go and do this case, But the muttering, and you think, I'm missing lines. Oh my God, this is terrible. The sound is awful in this movie. I'm not going to be able to hear the dialogue. And then at a certain point, it stops and they're back in the police office, or they're in the library looking at the book of the 7 Deadly Sins or something. And there's a quiet and a calm. And instantly you just it's a huge relief. You're absolutely, you're almost bathed in gratitude for the fact that all that kind of noise has stopped. And you're aware that it has been a deliberate kind of priming device. The kind of you're almost straining forward in your seat to try and hear them and work out what's going on. The West Wing used to do it brilliantly as well. Slightly different thing, but the West Wing, the series, the first 10 minutes every episode would be in media res. Everything would start. They were already in a crisis. You weren't allowed to work. You weren't being told what the crisis was. There was a certain bill that was not going to get ratified if they didn't get this speech ready by the afternoon or whatever. And you were like, I don't understand. And British audiences would assume it was also partly because we weren't American and we had that disadvantage. And then at a certain point, I suspect in America after the first commercial break, but we didn't have one, there would be a conversation, Josh very often and his secretary, where they would explain what was going on. You get the exposition that would bring you up to speed. But by then you were already kind of panicking that you didn't have it. And so there was, instead of kind of going, oh, it's the exposition, you were like, oh my God, thank you. Finally, somebody's explaining to me what's going on.
But those are dangerous techniques for our listeners. Yeah. Is there a number one tip to engage an audience quickly?
Well, if you're intending to be funny, then you do need to commit and try to be funny quite quickly. You can't hold it off for too long because they will think, but not everyone addressing a corporate audience has to be funny. But if you are going to use humor, not the very first thing you say, but I guess, again, it's the timing, the rhythm. I would say one comment. All right, David, nice to see you. How's the wife? Okay, good. She over that difficulty issue? Yeah, fine. Just like a little kind of
aside.
Yes, exactly. Something of that sort. Rather than coming and going, before I start, here's a joke. You can't do that.
No.
If something, it's very important to be in the room for at least, 15, ideally half an hour beforehand, and be aware of everything that's gone on. I say that as a comedian as well. I used to hate it if you tried to double up and you arrived just in time to go on stage. You had no idea what had happened before. you'd never have a good gig in those circumstances. You've got to soak up the atmosphere, but also the specifics, so you can say, if there's been an interruption earlier, let's say somebody's dropped a tray of drinks or something, go, before I start, has everyone got their drinks this time? That kind of thing. Just to acknowledge that incident happened earlier and you don't want that happening again. Things like that. They don't have to be witty. They just have to acknowledge the reality that you're all in. I think that is a very safe way of getting just enough of a laugh to bed you in, I
think that's brilliant. And I always talk about that listening to a room, because I think that any great performer is listening and taking in, and that means listening with the eyes as well, and taking in what's actually happening, because sometimes the funniest things are just those little asides or saying something that actually happened, rather
absolutely
than that here's a gag,
Totally.
I completely agree.
I always get a laugh. Radio theatre, whether they record Radio 4 plays, I think it's Art Deco kind of architecture. You can't always see it depending on how many screens they've got up. It just has a vaguely Third Reich vibe about it. It just looks very slightly like one of the big rallies. And any attention you draw to that always gets a laugh. And I think partly because it's a little bit risky as well, because there's always a suggestion that I might have an unpalatably keen interest in Third Reich architecture and decor, but things like that, anything you can point out, just like, Arthur Smith, always used to do jokes about where the fire extinguishers were if there were any students in, that sort of thing. It just, anything that anchors it to the situation you're in, the environment, so that they don't think you're phoning it in. That's another important thing, just to let them know you're really there,
be relevant to the situation. I think that's great. Anyway, Simon, we've reached the point in the show which we like to call quick fire questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Quick fire questions.
You're a comedian, so who is the funniest business person that you've met? Somebody who isn't in the business of comedy.
Well, I haven't met that many. Obviously, I've seen a few people talking on TV or whatever in conferences, but there is a man I know. He's the father of one of my very best friends. My friend's name is Danny Solomon, and his dad's name is Sir Harry Solomon. He's a significant North London Jewish businessman. He's a part owner, I think, of Hillsdown Holdings was his big firm. I remember when it was floated on the stock exchange when I was sharing a house with Danny at university, and I suddenly realized that he had a slightly different life than my own. But Sir Harry is a very funny man, very, very funny indeed. A lot of his humour revolves around football. He's a Middlesbrough fan. And he can banter with his son brilliantly about, they can be walking. We occasionally been on a couple of walks through the countryside because the old man's well into his 80s now, but he's still fit. And they'll see like a village name, and it will be like, I don't know, Haymore, Staffordshire or something, and go, Haymore, Staffordshire, he was a left back for Leighton Orient, wasn't he? And they just have this kind of banter, which is brilliant. So he's a man who has coped with it with huge amounts of success and prestige, and has kept his feet very, very, on the ground. I think he reminds me, I've never met him, but he's a little bit like what I imagine Warren Buffett must be like, hasn't moved house, hasn't kept constantly upgraded his car every time he gets, I think humor is a big part of his success. Personally, I remember registering in the first time he came down and took us out to dinner when I was at Southampton, that this was a man who had enormous success, but immediately put you at your ease because he was funny.
Oh, brilliant! I will look him up.
Mm.
You are a wonderful writer, and you really have an amazing facility with words. What book makes you laugh?
Well, I bought some Woodhouse yesterday, and I think anyone who's ever encountered Woodhouse, would have to put him on the very top shelf. Maybe that's a bit obvious. David Sedaris used to, he's been writing for about 25 years now, Sedaris, and I kind of feel like maybe I've got it. He is. I find his voice, the way he speaks, it has a very markedly lisping sort of gay American accent. He is gay. I'm not complaining about that, but it's almost like a stage gay, the way he speaks. And I find him in prose much more enjoyable. I like to, read it at my own pace. But his book, Me Talk Pretty One Day, I mean, I do remember, people say, don't read this in public transport because you'll just be laughing and it'll annoy people. It was that laugh out loud funny. That would be his funniest book for me. I would say that would be one of them. Douglas Adams used to make me laugh, like almost until I was gasping for breath. And that Patrick Campbell story that I mentioned, The Hot Box, that is one of the funniest things I've ever read. Alan Corran as well could write at that level. Steady on, Mr. Beethoven, that was your fifth, about Beethoven's liver demonstrating his alcoholism and Corran defending Beethoven's right to enjoy a drink.
Oh, well, no, wonderful. Great. There are a lot of choices there. What film?
If you want one book that will gather them all together, Frank Muir wrote, I think it's called The Oxford Book of British Humour. It's a big compendium, which you can pick up for a couple of quid on Amazon in hardback. It was out probably 30 or 40 years ago. An incredible anthology of great British prose. I think that would be my Desert Island book, probably.
Oh, fantastic. What film makes you laugh, Simon?
My worry is that it's going to be all too obvious. Most of my sort of top selections are widely understood to be. Spinal Tap would be one, definitely.
My favorite.
I love, I mean, all of that, again, those improv guys. The Best in Show is lovely as well, actually, from them, possibly slightly more underrated. I did think, I mean, I don't know if is it quite a comedy? I think Groundhog Day is a masterpiece, and because it has that bittersweet element as well, incredibly funny, but also it's saying something important about life. And then I think the great screwball comedies like His Girl Friday would be a good one. Cary Grant, Rosalind Russell, from the 30s, old black and white movie. The speed of the dialogue, the snap of the whole thing, incredible. Or a little bit later, Some Like It Hot. That's about as funny as a film could be. You can't fit any more jokes in and good jokes. The turnaround on some of those routines is like a single word batted. It's not even like a tennis match. It's like a kind of slapping match. It's extraordinary speed. Yeah. No, probably if I was forced to name one, I think Some Like It Hot, I would think.
No, just a classic, superb. We're going to take a shift to the other side, and I think I know you and where you're going to come from on this question. But what's not funny?
Well, as we've said earlier, I don't think there's any subjects that aren't funny, but generally speaking, I don't like it when I sense that a comedian is wanting to be liked. That's what will kill a joke for me. If I sense that a comedian is telling a routine or taking an angle or taking an approach to a subject because they want you to like them, or because they're they're foregrounding something other than their job, which is to be funny. I didn't like Hannah Gadsby's Nanette show, not because I disapproved of her message, but because I'd been told I was about to watch a stand-up comedy show, and instead I was subjected, I felt, to what amounted to a lecture about why stand-up comedy is not necessarily a force for good, because it lets people off the hook instead of confronting and dealing with difficult issues such as the homophobia she encountered as a young woman in Tasmania. Now, that's a perfectly legitimate subject for her to talk about, but it wasn't stand-up comedy as far as I was concerned. Now, obviously, I'm in a minority, or at least she found a sizable enough minority herself to make a lot of money out of that show. And the video I saw was filmed at the Sydney Opera House, so she did well out of it. But I don't find that funny. I find that preaching and hectoring and sanctimonious, to be honest, and that isn't funny to me. If you're trying to make kind of, I don't know, social justice points or whatever with comedy, if they're funny, that's great, and you're left afterwards with the realization that refugees there, but for the grace of God go I. Yeah, of course, that's absolutely fine. But if the message has been allowed to dominate where the comedy goes rather than the comedy itself,
no. So that's a personal thing, but. Being a libertarian, you wouldn't get in anybody's way for doing it.
Oh, I would never, ever protest outside a show or something. Absolutely not. I mean, it's counterproductive anyway. It just makes people want to go and see it, doesn't it? But
That's true, isn't it?
I think those South Park guys did well out of that. And actually, I mean, I went to see Jerry Springer the opera because of the protests, and I thought it was shit. But I never would have gone to see it if it hadn't been for the protests. So there you go.
It's sometimes counterproductive, isn't it? What word makes you laugh?
Good. Yeah. Well, my wife and I used to share words that we found were funny. I like small woodland animal type words like ferret, stoat, weasel. I don't know why. There's all of those words. All the small kind of little rustling leaf animals are all funny. I like words like foist. I do like little word. I like kind of words that have a single syllable but have a little bit of like thumb, for instance. Thumb is a funny word. I just think it's a little stubby, protuberance. The thing itself is quite funny, but the thumb. I don't know. It's just like I don't like long. Some people do like long, fancy, perspicacious, type. There was a great Ruttles lyric. You're so pusillanimous. Oh, yeah, nature's calling and I must go there, which I did like the use of pusillanimous there because they'd broken it down for the rhyme in the set. But broadly speaking, I think all those long, clever words are not funny. I'm much more of an Anglo-Saxon. Again, I go back to Galtman Simpson. Hancock, I think it was, saying, I thought my mother's cooking was bad, but at least her gravy used to move about a bit. Now, I don't know what you'd say was the funny word there, but it's the absence of funny. It's like, move about a bit. Do you know what I mean? It's like, go on, move about a bit. That's funnier than any kind of, at least her gravy had some mobility. I mean, that wouldn't be funny. No, I'll tell you who's a master at choosing them well, though, is Bob Mortimer. I'm reading his autobiography at the moment, which is lovely, light bedtime reading. Very, very funny, lovely man, of course. But he is a lot of his passages of remembering his work as a solicitor and stuff are elevated by just a really unusual, well-chosen. The more specific, usually, that's a good rule of thumb. I was taught that very early on. David Jason getting a laugh when he was complaining to Nicholas Hindhurst in Only Fools and Horses that, I remember when you were a young lad and I was a young man, I was trying to get out, meet girls, and instead, every time I try and leave the house, I'd have your puke on me, Ben Sherman's. Nice because they were not my trousers or my shirt, but a very specific. You could immediately picture him looking like trying to leave the house like a young mod, and he's got a younger brother who's just thrown up on him.
Yeah, John Sullivan was a genius with that turn of phrase as well.
Yeah, he was.
What sound makes you laugh?
Sound, well, I do like that kind of balloon squeak, that, like a rubbery squeak. Yeah, very fond of those. And that one where you let a bit of air out of a balloon by, with the neck, where you're pulling the neck, that thing?
Yeah,
you've got a balloon blown up, it make it, yeah. My dad used to get a similar sound out of a bit of grass. He could hold it between his thumbs and then blow through it. Do you remember seeing that?
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and he used to say they were dangeroos. That's what he collected. Oh, there's dangeroos in these woods. So that was a lovely sound. That's a good sound as well.
The penultimate question. We know that you are, have a background in legal and you write brilliantly and everything. Would you rather be considered clever or funny?
Well, definitely funny rather than clever, because clever is that is often a backhanded compliment. Oh yeah, that's all very clever, but I can see what you're trying to do there.
Too clever by half.
Yeah, exactly. I used to sell carpet cleaning door to door, and in university holidays. And a classic thing, you got your little checklist going, oh, madam, can I just check? Have you got any carpets that are more than 3 years old? Oh, you have. Oh, dear. Okay. And they'd go through all this stuff. And they'd all listen, and they'd often be a bored housewife and they'd have sort of 10 minutes to spare just listening, but they had no intention of buying, Sometimes they were too busy and they'd I've no time. Sometimes at the end of it, they'd always go, you're very clever, but I'm not interested. If I was very clever, you wouldn't have noticed that I was very clever. Do you know what I mean? The cleverness. Art is not art, which announces itself. You have to conceal it. Having said all of that, I do hope that as well as being funny, people think I am, I have some unusual and perhaps esoteric reference points, that I have something to introduce to the conversation that isn't just ordinary or obvious, that I've maybe not thought about things deeply, but maybe have got a slightly lateral, or oblique angle on things. And it's not quite the same as being clever, but it's not, I wouldn't think of myself as a clown. I don't generally think of myself as somebody whose instinct is like the hawk for the rabbit. You know, when I see a joke, I'm not that guy. There are some comedians who are like that, who are just their instinct. Lee Mack is a good example. You know, whenever you're with Lee, he will observe, he will spot the funny in anything you say. It can be tiring, you know. He's not quite, but he is almost always on, and it can almost be, you know, enough. Okay, but I'm not like that. I'm not one of those people. You could go a whole evening with me without me being funny at all, and instead trying to, I suppose, if I'm honest, sort of impress you or at least entertain you with my erudition, you know, and that kind of stuff, because I do find that kind of conversation at least as valuable and worthwhile as one in which people are just, you know, popping crackers.
Yeah, well, you can be both clever and funny, and generally funny people are always clever, to be honest.
I do think it's a sign of intelligence for me. But then again, of course, it may be a sign that you're on the same intellectual wavelength. Do you know what I mean? There might be people who would look at me and think he's not clever enough to be funny, and there's other people who kind of go, "Oh, he's all very funny, clever, but he's not very funny." Do you know what I mean? I think it's we tend to share a sense of humour with people with whom we also have roughly the same reading age, if you know what I mean.
12. Yeah. And finally, Simon, desert island gags. You can only take one joke with you to a desert island.
Wow.
What would it be?
Well, that is a good question. I think there might be one or two that I've forgotten that I really should name, but there is one that I do remember. The first time I heard it, I just thought that is glorious, about the little German boy who, I don't know if he's adopted. It's a British joke. I think he's adopted and he's German, and his parents bring him up, and they make sure that because they know he's adopted, and they know that life might be problematic for him. They make sure everything is absolutely perfect. You know, they never argue. His dinner is always there on time, and he's looked after very well. And he doesn't speak. He doesn't speak until about his 6th birthday, and they're very worried, but they've never raised it or taken him to the doctor. They're just sure, give him time or whatever. And they bring out his birthday cake, and he blows out the candles, and they give him a slice of cake, and he takes a bite, and he goes, "Oh, there is wax on the top of the cake." And they say, "Oh my God, you spoke. You can speak." He goes, "Yes, of course I can speak. I'm 6 years old." And they go, "Well, why haven't you not spoken until now?" And he says, "Well, up until now, there's been no need to complain."
Oh, that's a brilliant gag and a wonderful way to end a wonderful
It's lovely,
interview.
isn't it? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, Simon.
I can't be sure whether he needs to be German, but that's how I heard it.
Well, it's perfect, and a perfect way to end the perfect interview. Simon Evans, thank you so much for being a wonderful guest on the Humourology Podcast.
Absolute pleasure, Paul. Thank you for having me.
The Humourology Podcast was hosted by Paul Boross, produced by David Rose, music by Steve Hayworth, creative direction by Les Hughes, and additional research by Helen Sykes. Please remember to subscribe, like, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. This has been a Big Sky production.